Well, thank you all very much for being here. I'm State Senator George Borrello from the 57th Senate District, and we are here in Mayville at our Office of Emergency Services to talk about the impact of the so-called criminal justice reforms. I started off today thinking this morning to myself that it was November of 2019 when I was still county executive here in Chautauqua County and the newly senator-elect for the 57th Senate District, where we held a press conference with a lot of the same folks that you see behind me here. And the purpose of that press conference was to essentially send a warning of what was going to happen come January 1st, 2020, when the so-called criminal justice reforms would go into place. And myself and the folks on the front line in law enforcement who were completely ignored in the development of these pieces of legislation warned us what was going to happen. And sadly, we stand here today, 2 years later, saying, unfortunately, we were right. Crime is spiking in almost every category. The idea that we can just tell people to show up for court, and if you don't show up for court, that's okay. We're going to send you an email reminder, like you're late for school. And what has that resulted in? Well, the data, which is somewhat incomplete, is still rather disturbing. Statewide, murders are increased about 47%. Aggravated assaults are up. Burglary is up. Car thefts are up. And although, unfortunately, the state has avoided trying to actually gather true data, the anecdotal evidence that I'm sure some of the folks behind me will talk about is also disturbing. The fact that roughly 4 in 10 of those who are given an appearance ticket don't even show up for the court date. We're seeing huge spikes in people with mental health crises, people that could be getting help if they were in jail or in prison, are not getting the necessary help that they need because they're on the street. And we've seen multiple recurrence, people that are getting out and reoffending, in some cases 12 times before their first court appearance. And what has the governor said? She said that she needs more studies. She needs more information. Well, folks, I think the information is pretty clear. But before I turn over to our first speaker, I just want to say that, when I became a state senator, I was maybe a little naive. I thought that when you wrote a piece of legislation, you listened to all the stakeholders, that you got input from everyone that's impacted. Well, the bail reform laws and the discovery laws show that there was absolutely no consultation with the district attorneys, with the members of law enforcement, people that do probation, people that deal with addiction services. None of those folks were consulted. The only people consulted were the radical special interests, largely based in New York City, the people who feel that nobody should be in jail ever for anything. Those are the people that wrote the so-called bail reform laws. And did we need tweaks to our bail? Absolutely. But the problem is, the only focus, it wasn't crafting a responsible piece of legislation that actually helped the people that perhaps have been caught up in the system. The only goal for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle was to prove that New York was the most progressive. That's the silly contest that they decided they wanted to win, which has led to unnecessary death and victimization of thousands of New Yorkers. New York State is the only state that undertook bail reform and chose not to give something as simple as giving judges discretion. The only state that does not consider dangerousness in whether or not someone should be released onto the streets. So countless unnecessary victims are now out there that have suffered as a result of this irresponsible push to so-called reform our criminal justice system. So with that being said, I'd like to first call up our Undersheriff, Richard Telford, here in Chautauqua County.
Thank you. All of us up here have several different examples that we could give. We could be here for the next couple hours. I just plan on using 2 examples recently. Back in December, we had an individual that was attempted to be stopped for a traffic violation. He led officers on a high-speed pursuit for somewhere between 12 to 15 minutes before he was stopped and apprehended. The investigation revealed that the vehicle he was driving was stolen out of the city of Cleveland, Ohio. He was charged with driving under the influence of narcotics and numerous vehicle and traffic charges. This individual resided in Cleveland, Ohio. Looking at the timeline in our computer system, he was booked into our jail at 6 a.m. He appeared in front of a judge and was released at 8 a.m. At about noon that day, Sheriff's Office got a report of a stolen motor vehicle from a residence just outside of Mayville. And a few hours later, about 5 o'clock that night, that stolen motor vehicle was located in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. This is an individual that led officers on a dangerous pursuit, had no regard for the citizens or drivers on the roads. He's from Cleveland, Ohio. He has not appeared for his court date. There are currently warrants out for him. So if and when he is picked up, it will be an additional cost to our office and the taxpayers to go spend the time and the money to go pick him up and bring him back from Cleveland. A second example that I'm going to cite is a young female that is known to have a drug problem. She was brought into our jail between May and October of 2020, a 6-month period. She was brought in 8 separate times. It was either on new charges or on warrants because she did not answer to the charges. The first 7 times she appeared and was immediately released. During that time frame, she was also the victim of a drug overdose. Fortunately, she survived, but this is an example that it's not only the protection of the citizens that we're looking for, it is the protection of the defendants, where if she would have been held on bail in jail, there's more likelihood that she would be getting some services and treatment that she needed. It took the 8th arraignment and 8th arrest until bail was finally set. She spent about 2 months in jail. She has again since been released, and there are also warrants for her arrest. I think one of the biggest things we are looking for in law enforcement is to give the judges that discretion back and the ability to evaluate each case and each defendant individually and not with a broad brush. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Under Sheriff. Yeah, I think that's an important point, that we need to treat things individually and not paint with that broad brush. Because in an effort to achieve some kind of political scorecard, we've made our cities and our streets more dangerous. So thank you again for that. I just want to give, I'm going to give my colleague, Andy Goodell, a colleague in the Assembly who also has been a champion on this, the opportunity to speak. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, George. One of the most important functions of government is to make sure our communities are safe for our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've seen more of a focus and concern for criminals than a concern for our communities. And as the Senator has mentioned, the recent changes in the law that were pushed through by a Democrat majority and a Democrat governor have had devastating impacts on public safety. 46.7% increase in murders. 54.3% increase in motor vehicle thefts. There were 220,000 people last year who were victims of theft. We've talked a little bit about the catch and release, bail elimination, where defendants are sometimes back on the street before the victims have even been contacted. But that's one of several initiatives. We also saw an initiative to make it so that young adults under the age of 21 are referred to family court rather than criminal court, even for serious crimes. This bill should be called the Gang Recruitment Act, because what's happening is that violent criminal gangs are recruiting young people under the age of 21 to carry out the most serious crimes, knowing they won't spend time in jail and their record will be sealed. As a result, we have seen a 1,000% increase in the number of gun arrests for people under the age of 18. And sadly, 48% of 16-year-olds who have been arrested since this bill has come into play have been rearrested for additional crimes. We've imposed unrealistic discovery requirements on our DAs, which dramatically increase the amount of paperwork that both our prosecutors and our police have to complete, including disclosing the name and contact information of witnesses, making witness intimidation that much easier. Just last year, the legislature pushed through a bill to convert parole into early release by stating that even a substantial violation of the terms and conditions of parole would not result in a revocation of parole. One of the most amazing bills was a bill that reduced the maximum sentence for a Class A misdemeanor by 1 day. And you might think, why would you reduce the maximum sentence for 1 day? And as all the gentlemen behind me know, that if you have a maximum sentence for a Class A misdemeanor, it's almost always because the defendant pled guilty to a Class A misdemeanor as part of a plea bargain for a serious felony. And so why the 1 day reduction in the maximum sentence? So that those who are arrested and convicted and sentenced to the maximum would not be automatically deported if they were an immigrant. Because apparently, we want to be a safe haven for those criminals. And even after an individual has been arrested, convicted, sentenced, and sent to prison, there's been a concerted effort to relax all the prison safeguards, including severe restrictions on the use of special housing units. And that's resulted in a sharp increase in assaults on other inmates and on our correction officers. It is time we refocus on what the proper role of government is, which is a concern for the safety of our community, and putting that first and foremost over ensuring that criminals can avoid jail time and get out to commit new crimes while pending trial. And I appreciate deeply the efforts of everyone behind me who devote their full time and their full effort to helping keep our communities safe. It's time that they had a real partner in the state legislature. Senator Borrello and I have introduced legislation to address these issues, and I hope all my colleagues take up that legislation as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Andy. So I'm going to call up next our Chautauqua County DA, Jason Schmidt.
All right, Jason. Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not, and it shouldn't be a political issue. This is a community issue. It's a public safety issue that affects each and every one of us. And to the governor, to our state legislatures, legislators in Albany, I would say, speak to the victims and speak to the witnesses of crimes. You know, these are people that, after summoning the courage to call the police, put themselves out on the line, get rewarded by seeing the person who's charged with the crime, because they had the courage, back out on the street and not returning to court for sometimes months later, not being arrested in many instances because notices of appearances are issued. And as a result, they're back in harm's way, and they don't want to cooperate with authorities. They don't feel very protected by the laws. They don't have any opportunity or any recourse available to them. They don't have any of the constitutional protections that the defendants are afforded. And this is a byproduct of the bail reform laws. Speak to the police directly about what it's like to work overtime because you had to make an arrest and you risked your life and you couldn't go to your kid's soccer game or you couldn't be home for your anniversary because you have to prepare the necessary paperwork associated with an arrest and compliance with the new discovery laws. And meanwhile, the person that they arrested has been out on the streets for hours now. And when they finally catch up with this individual, it's because, and we see this all the time, because they've committed new crimes and they have to arrest them again, and the process starts over and over again. And speak with the court personnel and our local judges who constantly have to reschedule these initial appearances because these same individuals who've impacted the police, who've impacted the victims and the witnesses, they couldn't even bother to show up on their appearance dates. I mean, this is a public safety issue. It's not political. It affects each and every one of us, and it impacts how we're going to govern ourselves as a community, how we want to handle the balancing of public safety with the constitutional rights of people who are accused of crimes. There's a better way. There are solutions. We need to address those solutions now. We need to restore judicial discretion to our judges because they're in the community. They know what's going on. They know the players here. So I would say that to the governor, to the state legislators. It's time for a change. The change is actually very easy to implement. The proposals are there. Let's take advantage of them now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you. D.A. Schmidt brings up a good point, particularly when he says that this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This week we actually had hearings, and I was able to question and talk with Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, and Byron Brown, the mayor of Buffalo, both Democrats, and both saying that there needs to be changes to the bail reform. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle really went after Eric Adams about his position. And finally Eric Adams said, look, you don't have to debate me. Why don't you debate the mother of the infant that was shot in the face in Times Square? Why don't you debate the families of those two fallen officers that were ambushed by someone who should have not been on the streets? That's really the human impact here. The human impact is you can talk about statistics, but every single day in New York State, new victims are being created unnecessarily. And when folks like Eric Adams and Byron Brown, the folks that are charged with keeping their citizens safe, stand up to their own party and say enough is enough, that's when you know there has to be change. And that's when you know that the people that are pulling the strings are not the people that are on the front lines. Whether it's law enforcement or elected officials, it's the special interests that have really a hidden agenda, and none of it has to do with what's good for New York State. So with that, I will call up Cuba Police Chief Dustin Birch.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank Senator Borrello for inviting me to attend this press conference today, and of course I'd like to obviously thank Sheriff Catrone also for hosting us. I know he's not here, but we appreciate the help. Get my paper to sit still here. I've heard them talk about politics a little bit. One thing I want to say is I'm not an elected official, I'm a police chief, and I bring that up because I've never run for anything. The furthest I've ever run is a half marathon with my wife. So the point I'm trying to make is I know a lot of Democrats, I know a lot of Republicans, I know a lot of independents, and I know people that just don't even want to register anymore. And they all the ones that I know, whether they're victims or not, also agree. And they're in our office complaining about the bail reform laws, and we see it all the time. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think they're right about the political aspect of it. It doesn't matter what walk of life you are, it's affecting everybody. So with that, I've got some statistics here. I had to write them down because there's a lot to remember, and we were only supposed to bring 2 or 3. We probably I could have brought quite a few more, but I brought 2 that kind of were more recent and stuck in our mind a little more. So, and it's, again, with great pleasure that I stand up here with law enforcement from several counties and several different levels of government. It's an honor to stand here for this cause. Our community, like many others, has had several incidents in which the bail reform laws have caused good, law-abiding citizens to live in fear and frustration because an offender violated them in one way or another with no consequences or penalties for their actions. So in our community, we had an offender between the summer of 2020 and 2021 that committed 5 felony counts of grand larceny for stealing motor vehicles, 2 felony counts of burglary, 5 felony counts of criminal possession of stolen property, which included firearms from a rod and gun club that he broke into, criminal possession of controlled substance, 2 counts of aggravated unlicensed operation, 2 counts of unregistered motor vehicles, and 2 counts of operating a motor vehicle on a highway without insurance. This individual stole multiple motor vehicles from residents and was handed an appearance ticket every time. At one point, he stated to our officers, "Just give me my appearance ticket so I can get out of here." And that's mild rhetoric compared to what most people are saying to us now that they know there's no consequences. He left. After we handed him his last appearance ticket, he went to our local fire department and proceeded to steal another vehicle and drove it back to the police station because he had forgotten his wallet and ID in our lobby. Last week, many people have seen this, but we had an individual that, thanks to good police work, was caught in the act of committing a crime, but not before smashing windows out, and he was pouring gasoline inside an event center in our village. He was planning to set the building on fire. After a foot pursuit, the individual was apprehended, and he had a police radio on him and a large knife. The officer that was calling it into our dispatch center could hear himself transmitting through his jacket. And the individual was issued his appearance ticket also with a court date down the road. And that was about a month later that he was supposed to come back. So you can imagine how the staff at the event center felt the next day when they were having to come to work knowing he was not in jail and having to hold that fear in their mind that he might show up again, holding a grudge against the staff. And of course, we had to staff that with more police, which cost us overtime and additional manpower. So it's also taxing on the taxpayers. There's been a lot of negative talk about policing over the last few years and the criminal justice system in general. Some of it, I'll admit, I think everybody would admit is warranted, but most of it is not. There's something the public should probably know about police if you don't already. They know what people are capable of in ways that, thankfully, most of us do not. They've seen the first-hand battered woman or the man from an abusive relationship or the neglected, or in one case our agency had deceased infant from abuse. They've seen the trembling rape victim shaking with fear. They assume the worst and they take that on so good people can go about their day and not have to live with that fear. They provide that luxury and they provide that service. I know it to be true to me because I see it every day. We have good police officers and sheriff's deputies and state troopers, federal levels, attorneys on the streets and in the courtrooms providing those luxuries. The current bail reform law is hindering us from providing shelter and security for people, and in my opinion, it needs to be amended. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate it. The Chief talked about, a guy that almost burned a place down and in Cuba, a historic building that lots of people put a lot of time in restoring.
Yes.
And, that's really tragic that this happened. And again, that these people have to live in fear. There's another story I wanted to try and find from, this is in a similar vein. This is in my colleague Mike Martucci's district, this just happened. A serial arsonist in Sullivan County was charged on January 14th with arson and burglary for 2 fires that occurred on January 10th and January 13th. Because of the state's bail reform laws, he wasn't held, but instead he was released into the community. 1 day later, January 15th, he set fire to an empty vacation home in Sullivan County. Billy Steinberg, a 37-year-old assistant fire chief with the Forestburg Fire Company, responded to the blaze and collapsed and died while fighting that fire. My friends on the other side of that like to say, well, this is just about misdemeanors, nonviolent crimes. How is arson not violence? How about somebody walking around with a loaded gun? How is that not violent? There are so many things that, and again, I also want to say, if your house was burglarized or you were carjacked, that's also not considered violence. And I'm sorry, but just because something is nonviolent doesn't mean it doesn't create victims and destroy lives. And in this case, an arsonist turned into basically a manslaughter, a murderer, because of the death of Billy Steinberg. Those are the real impacts of this. Next up, I'd like to call up Dunkirk Police Chief Dave Ordolano.
Good afternoon. I just want to start by thanking George and Andy. You guys are champions for law enforcement and public safety, and I know I can speak for everyone here that we appreciate that you guys stand behind us all the time.
Thank you, Dave.
My theme for today is going to be, what about the victims' rights and the rights of law-abiding citizens? There are no consequences for breaking the law or illegal behavior. Under bail reform, all the rights are for those breaking the law. There's no longer respect for victims' rights, no respect for the law, and there's no respect for police officers anymore. And those breaking the law aren't afraid to tell us that. That, along with the burden that has been placed on law enforcement in the district attorney's office with unrealistic time constraints for discovery related to evidence and investigative demands, that, for lack of a better term, handcuffs us and makes it difficult and many times almost impossible to comply with those evidentiary and investigative demands in the mandatory timeframes under the bail reform. Now, as everyone I think has said here today, there's always a need to review things and change things for the better if we can. I don't think anyone will argue that when that change is appropriate. But the original intent of bail reform has snowballed into the leading issues we face today across our state, with rising crime rates, blatant criminal activity, and assaults and attacks on police officers, which are at an all-time high at this point in time. There are no consequences for criminal actions or behavior. What about the victims' rights and the rights of law-abiding citizens for quality of life in their neighborhoods? Repeated courses of disorderly subjects, harassment, noise, assaults, I could go on and on. Our only help to our residents in our neighborhoods for quality of life is an appearance ticket. After that, another appearance ticket. After that, another appearance ticket. They continue to live in fear as the bad guys stay right there and enjoy telling us, as Chief Birch said, just give me my appearance ticket. What about the victims' rights and rights of law-abiding citizens when there are drug houses poisoning and destroying their neighborhoods and our communities? Tuesday of this week, 3 days ago, we did a substantial hit on a drug house in our city that was a major supplier of cocaine and heroin operation. Bad guys were back at the house, 2 of them on Tuesday night. The third, Wednesday, because of bail reform, and one of the subjects was 17 years old, and under the legislation for raise the age, he just got let go. What about the rights of the neighborhood victims to not live in fear of these drug dealers? What neighbor would be willing to step up when they know that these people will be back the same day, or at the latest, the next day, to terrorize their neighborhood again? Drug dealers laugh at us. They continue with no threat of punishment or consequences for what they do. I've personally heard them say, I can't believe this is all you can do to me. What about the rights of our business owners who have the same subject, and this is a true story, steal from their store 10 times in 1 week? And all my officers could do is give them 10 appearance tickets so they could go back and do it again. Or the business establishment that is disrupted by subject fighting or being disorderly, and all we can do is give them an appearance ticket and they can go right back in and continue to do what they want to do. And when these subjects don't show for court, there's no recourse. Because when we find them, they just go to court and get another appearance date and don't show up again. Right now, our city court is running close to a 30 to 40% no-show rate. What about the rights of 2 elderly female victims in the first ward of my city who were terrorized by a subject breaking into their house, assaulting and injuring them, firing a shotgun through their ceiling? Subject was released for what they told us on the least restrictive form of bail, which was no bail and report to probation supervision. These victims were in fear of their safety as he was walking the neighborhood the next day. What about the rights of our judges who are victims of bail reform? They are elected by the citizens of their communities to keep their communities safe. They should be able to have the discretion to set bail for offenses that disrupt the quality of life in their communities, for repeat offenders, and for crimes against people. I'm sure they are just as frustrated as we are that they have no discretion to do what is right for the communities they serve as well. In closing, I'm going to simply ask again, what about the victims' rights and the rights of our law-abiding citizens and business owners? That is a question that I have to answer to the citizens of my community each and every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I want to put an exclamation point on the example that Dave gave, because again, the thing that I hear, the rhetoric, the lie that I hear from my colleagues and those that support bail reform is, it's only for nonviolent misdemeanors. The guy broke into the home of 2 elderly people, assaulted one of them, discharged a firearm into the ceiling. Tell me, with a straight face, that that is a nonviolent offense. So let's just dispense with that, because that's a lie. Maybe that was their intention at the beginning, but once the radicals got a hold of that piece of legislation, it went well beyond that. 90% of crimes in New York State no longer are eligible for bail. That means 9 out of 10 crimes committed get the equivalent of a traffic ticket, an appearance ticket. Arsonists, pedophiles, people that have committed the worst crimes, murder. I mean, it's ridiculous. The victims are racking up here in New York State. I just want to, before we take questions, I just want to ask if anybody else would like to speak, if the moment moved you to speak. So, again, I really appreciate everybody being here, and I want to just talk a little bit about, it's easy to stand up here and just complain about things, but we actually do have legislation that we're pursuing, and it'll be in our press release. But Andy and I have, I think, a significant piece of legislation. I don't recall the bill number now, but what it would do is, number one, it would restore judicial discretion. That's the big piece that's missing. Judges being able to determine whether or not someone, on an individual basis, should be held because they are a danger to the public or to themselves. The other thing that it does, because I agree that there are situations where people who just don't have the money sit in jail unnecessarily, is it requires a regular review. This is, by the way, it's Senate Bill 1802. It requires a review of those cases on a regular basis. So no one should sit in jail. We're going to force, whether it's the district attorneys and those that are representing those in prison, to ensure that they are not forgotten in prison. Because that's what this was really about, right? But then it really created a whole political life of its own. We went from trying to protect those folks, quite frankly, the small number of people that are unnecessarily in jail because they just can't afford the bail, and that turned into really just appeasing the folks that believe that we should abolish the police department and shut down our prisons. Those are I know that's not an exaggeration, folks. You can look it up. Okay, members of Congress, members of the New York City Council, members of our own state legislature, that openly say we should abolish the police department, that we should close down prisons, that the police are the real threat to public safety. Those are the people that had the final approval of the legislation that is now law here in New York State. That's what we're dealing with. That's what all of these people behind me are dealing with, as well as parole officers, emergency services people, members of emergency service, people that have to deal with victims, the victims themselves. Imagine getting up every day and having to go do that because some politician in New York City thinks this is a good idea. That's where we are with this. So with that being said, I'll take any questions if we have any.
Senator, your legislation, Assemblyman Goodell's legislation, does it repeal all of the reforms that have been approved, or does it amend those?
It would repeal the bail aspect of it, yes. It would repeal the bail law, and it would restore judges' discretion. And it adds, and the whole idea of the dangerousness of a defendant being considered. Because again, that's one thing that, again, New York State is the only state that does this, that does not consider dangerousness and whether or not bail is applied.
So do you think you can get some Democratic support, some support from the other side of the aisle to at least change this aspect of it?
You know, I would hope so, and I'll tell you why. Because every single one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have to run and have to justify to their communities what's going on. And they can cite all these statistics that they like to cite, but if their residents, if their constituents don't feel safe, they have to answer for that. And when we push this forward and we try to force this out of committee, and it has to be voted on in those committees, they're going to have to raise their hand and say no. Okay, that's going to be an important day for them, politically and really as they have to answer to their own friends and loved ones.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Along those lines, as Senator Borrello mentioned, you are already starting to see prominent Democrats who are on the front line of this fight and see firsthand the devastating consequences of that misguided legislation, who are now willing to step up and start to put pressure on their own members in the legislature to change the law, including New York City Mayor Adams and Buffalo Mayor Byron Brown. The voters are also stepping up and starting to make their position known. And so over and over now we're seeing poll numbers where the public is saying this is outrageous that a criminal is back on the street committing more crimes within hours after they're arrested. And you see that sentiment reflected in election results as well. So just last fall, Senator Kaminsky, who ran for district attorney in Nassau County, which is a Democrat county, lost by over 20% when it became apparent that he helped draft this misguided legislation. So that combination of our law enforcement, members of the public who are saying, we're sick and tired of having our house broken into and our stuff stolen, which is such a horrific invasion of privacy, people feel like they've been violated. We're sick and tired of that. We need to focus on ensuring that our communities are safe for law-abiding residents. So Dave, sometimes government operates like a pendulum. It went way too far in one direction a couple of years ago, and now we are hopeful it'll come back to a more balanced approach.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Senator, you mentioned the hidden agenda.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you would speak to the question of Soros money involved. We know, first of all, that the ACLU has gotten a huge amount of Soros money and been involved in this bail reform. We also know that Soros money has been involved in the open borders. And they're a combination of things that you have Soros money. Is there any attempt to actually investigate the Soros involvement in this thing? Because all over the United States, Soros has been putting money in district attorneys' offices to get his candidates.
Well, I think it's troubling to see that. I will tell you that. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, I'm told was supported by George Soros. But I guess I'll leave the investigation part. I think that's something that should be done perhaps at the federal level. But I can tell you that you look at organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union. they've really, they've changed in the sense that they used to stand up for folks that are victims. And even on issues, not just criminal issues, but free speech issues, there's no doubt that they've been commandeered by the special interests. So I think it's important to note that who is behind this. And when I say hidden agendas, there are a few radicals out there, if you will, there's more of them now, that will admit that they want to abolish the police and shut down all the prisons. But there's also a lot that aren't willing to say it out loud, but do support it. And that's where, if you're going to say that the system isn't working, that it's broken, then you got to break it. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to break the system so that they can say it needs to be rebuilt, in their dystopian future of what New York State will look like.
Hi. Can you tell us, what's the process like to repeal this?
Well, it could be a simple process, to be quite frank, because we have been introducing what are called hostile amendments. We go on the floor of the legislature, the Senate, and the Assembly, and we amend a law, and then it's voted on. We will be doing that more and more, just like we did with the repeal of the governor's executive authority, Governor Cuomo's executive authority. So it could be easy for my colleagues. It could be easy for them to just vote yes when we introduce those amendments on the floor. Beyond that, then there is the process of this bill being taken up. We each have the opportunity to force a vote out in committee. And we intend to do that. I intend to do that to force a vote on this bill. And then, like I said, they've got to raise their hand and say whether they support it or don't. Now, if it passes committee, then it would go, and again, it's the system in New York State government is really, for lack of a better term, corrupt, because the majority controls whether or not something gets on a calendar. I mean, I've said for a long time, if state government operated half as well and as fairly as county government, we'd be a lot better off in New York State. Because, even here in Chautauqua County, I'll give you an example because I spent 10 years in county government. Even with a supermajority of Republicans, there's only 4 Democrats in the county legislature, and those 4 Democrats have the right to have any bill brought before any committee, and even if it fails in committee, they still have the right to sign that bill through, so it is heard on the floor of the county legislature, and that's a good thing. I don't care how big a majority one side or the other has. Those folks should have the right to have at least have their voice heard, at least to have those that are opposed to that bill speak out as to why they're opposed to that bill. And that's the fundamental difference. Most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't want to talk about this. They don't want to go on the floor of the Senate and the Assembly and defend the horrific results of this. They'd rather just squelch it, and that's what happens. That's why it's a problem, because this bill, which has every right, in my opinion, to see the light of day, will not, if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who control the process have their way. But we're going to keep pushing forward. And ultimately, it's up to the people, right? I mean, I get emails and text messages and social media contacts all the time about specific bills. Where do you stand on this, Senator Borrello? And I answer the question. So the bill is Senate 1802, and if you're concerned about public safety, why don't you ask your members of the state legislature, where do you stand on Senate 1802? That's the way to get that addressed. Greg, you had a question. I want to just make sure.
I just wanted to find out, you cite a lot of statistics, and where do they come from?
So we've cited a few different statistics. Most of them come from let's see, I had that answer. DCJS, Division of Criminal Justice Services. Yeah, so that's. Sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm kind of doing this. And
Greg, some of the statistics come from the New York City Criminal Justice Agency.
New York City Criminal Justice Agency?
Correct.
Okay.
And there are other places you can look. Again, that goes back to the point that the governor has said, well, she needs more data. Well, there is data out there. I will agree with her that it's incomplete, but it is troubling. And I think she's got more than enough data. If she wanted to stand up for the rights of victims and the safety of all New Yorkers, which, by the way, is her job as the chief executive officer of New York State, then she would use the data that we have to do whatever she could to push back against this, this dangerous change to our public safety.
George, you had mentioned earlier that Eric Adams and
Byron Brown
have spoken in favor of this. I've had the local mayor, Eddie Sundquist, on, who is a Democrat, and every time I've asked him the question on air and on the record, he has said we need to change bail reform.
Yeah.
And they've talked about it at NICOM. It seems like there are a number of upstate Democrats who support this effort that you folks have underway.
Yeah.
What should they be doing, or how can they influence change in downstate Democrats who are pushing and continue to push this?
Terry, that's a great question. Let me say, if you're a chief executive, if you're a mayor, if you're a county executive, I don't care, Democrat, Republican, you have to be concerned about this, because what it is it's a state government, essentially making your community, more dangerous, right? So that's why, and I applaud Eddie for saying that, as I do Byron Brown and Eric Adams. It's not a Republican or Democrat issue. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to make it into a Republican versus Democrat issue, because that's an easy thing to do, is to demonize the Republican Party. But this is not a partisan issue. It should not be a partisan issue. So I agree. And as to what they can do, they need to have organizations like NICOM, like NISAC, we've got the Sheriff's Association, there are all kinds of associations. They need to speak out, and they are speaking out. But they also have the ability of holding their local elected officials accountable, okay? I don't care if he is a Republican or Democrat, but if the mayor of Jamestown calls me to his office and asks me to talk about bail reform, I'm going to show up. And I would suggest that every other chief executive officer in New York State do the same thing for their state legislators. Call them into your office, show them the problem, and ask them to fix it.
Do you feel confident that this will go through?
Yeah, the bottom line is I'm confident that people will be talking about it, because they already are. And if we can get this forced through committee, either way, like I said, the best path is for the people of New York State that no longer feel that their government is serving them, that no longer feel safe. Ask about this bill. Ask about bail reform. Tell them the stories. That's important.
There are too many people who are being assaulted, robbed, burglarized, having their cars stolen, or people they know murdered in New York State for this issue to be ignored. It's not whether, it's when will this be amended. And we are hoping that the legislature on both sides of the aisle will amend this law and stop the horrific crime and the ramifications that occur as a result of it, and do so sooner rather than later.
I have a question for the district attorney, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How does this impact prosecution of local cases, specifically that revolving door? Does it make it more difficult when the criminal's back out on the street, as you mentioned earlier, committing other crimes?
Sure, in a number of ways. So what happens is, we're always fighting to maintain contact with witnesses and victims of crime. So that's number one, right? We need to maintain the integrity of our cases. The longer that these proceedings become more and more protracted, the harder that gets, and it taxes our resources, which are also being drawn from through the new discovery laws as well, which we haven't really gotten much into. But that's a big problem for us. We talk about speedy trial constitutional rights on behalf of the defendants, but the reality is that time is really on the side of the bad guys. For us, it's always in law enforcement's best interest to get a case to trial as soon as possible, because we maintain the integrity of the evidence, the witnesses, the victims, and we lose that when defendants don't show up. We lose that when they commit new crimes, and we have to therefore start to deal with those situations as well. So I think that's one of the biggest problems. The other area I think it's important, it's a little off topic, but I think it's very important, is that there's something else missing here when we talk about victims' rights and the witnesses as well, is that when we don't get these defendants into court, we can't get orders of protection to protect them, and that's a real problem. Now, we have certain mechanisms in place, but the reality is that it's really, for the most part, when they show up at court, that the victim's voice can actually be heard, and we don't have that available to us as well.
I know you mentioned in your first remarks that it seems to be harder for some victims to come back and face this, especially in many cases months, years later. Have you seen that here at a local level?
Absolutely. But this happens every single day. We are overwhelmed. We have a victims advocacy center in the DA's office. They are completely overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. The City of Jamestown Police Department, which is represented here by Captain Samuelson, they are overwhelmed dealing with victims. They're getting calls and domestic violence complaints constantly. They track these numbers, and they are just exponentially higher. They just have increased. In fact, during the pandemic, they just got worse. So it is so difficult, and you can imagine, because it implicates all kinds of other frustrations in our society, housing issues, especially victims of domestic violence who have nowhere else to go. They have to go home to sometimes the same person that has perpetrated the crime. So there's family court issues. Family court is right around the corner over here. Family court issues. And somebody has to hold their hand and get them through the system. What about, medical records? When you're dealing with victims of sex crimes, you've got to steer them to getting, the forensic evidence so that we can prosecute these crimes. Who's doing that? The police are taxed. Our office, we try our best to. We have specific designated individuals to do that hand-holding. We have separate outside resources that we're trying to bring in. We don't have that ability. It's just so frustrating, and it's maddening, and right now we are at a loss. We are the losing side here. There's a David and Goliath battle, but it's not the state of New York that is Goliath anymore. We are the Davids. Thank you.
Just a point on what Jason just said. I said before that, if you're instead of proving that the system is broken, they're trying to break it. They are absolutely overwhelming our system in an effort to say, well, that we need to replace it with something else. This whole idea that instead of sending in police officers, we're going to send in social workers into a violent crime that's in progress. The idea that we really don't have to hold someone because they may not have the ability to meet their bail, and not regard the fact that these people could be dangerous. And I'll say something else too, because I hear this often. The pushback is, well, why should poor people sit in jail when like a rich drug dealer can just pay his way out? The bottom line is the judge should have the discretion to say you're going in jail without bail because you are that dangerous. Your record is that long. Your flight risk is that high, and we don't have that discretion. So that's an important point.
Is that the key aspect?
Can I just one more follow-up? A lot of times people forget that the purpose of bail is to make sure the defendant shows up for trial. So when you have a bail that's posted and the defendant does not show up for trial, if it was a bail bondsman that posted the bail bondsman joins with the police to find that defendant, because otherwise they lose the bond. And if it's a cash bail that's been put up, they can use the cash bail to help track down that defendant to make sure he shows up for court. So when you eliminate bail, you not only have people on the streets that are dangerous, who are repeat offenders, that are going to commit further crimes, but you also undercut the ability to finance and incent people to get those defendants into court.
And my follow-up was just going to be, it sounds like that judicial discretion is the key aspect of restoring defendant's power.
Well, and look, I'll say this about judicial discretion. There are a lot of judges that are, we'll say like it is, soft on crime. So there's going to be a lot of areas where people are still going to walk the streets because as a judge it doesn't feel that there's enough to hold that person. But the bottom line, it kind of gives you more local control, right? The judges in our area are going to probably treat a little differently than judges in other areas. And that's fine, that's up to them. But to have no judicial discretion essentially means that the state is saying, we don't really care how dangerous the person is. We don't care what depth of knowledge that judge has. We don't care that these things have to be judged on an individual basis. We're just going to simply say, judges' hands are tied. These are the rules. 9 out of 10 crimes in New York State are not bail eligible, and that's where we are right now. And that's why you're hearing the tragic stories you're hearing from the people on the front lines of law enforcement because of that. Anything else? You want to? Oh.
Would you list some of the services that are available to defendants when they are incarcerated to correct There are poor choices.
Well,
There are many, you have them.
Yeah, well, and that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. When I was actually talking to Captain Samuelson about that on our way in. Our governor has announced that she's going to have new services for folks that are incarcerated. The problem is we don't have people that are incarcerated. These folks that have been let out of prison. We had a program here in Chautauqua County that was put in place while I was county executive to get substance abuse treatment to folks that are in prison. And then to get them on a release program contingent on them coming back to get regular treatment, drug treatments. There are all kinds, and I'm sure somebody else better than me can speak to this, but people do get help. If you believe in restorative justice, which I believe we all do, there's an opportunity for people to get substance use disorder treatments, to get vocational training. The governor wants to bring back the idea of paying for college tuition for people that are incarcerated. None of those things work if those folks are walking the streets and not where they can get the help that they need. That's really the fundamental difference. Sure.
We do have some programs like the GED program to assist getting a high school education. There are religious studies within the jail. There are drug treatment programs, mental health treatment programs, and what we are finding now is when bail is either not set or they're in and out of jail within a week, a lot of these programs are not productive because they start on the right track, but then they're released and unable to finish and complete it.
Just wanted to mention another unintended consequences of eliminating bail, and that is when they eliminated bail, they pulled the rug out from under some of our diversion courts. And what would happen is an individual would be arrested for drug or alcohol addiction. They'd be given an opportunity to go into a diversion program, which has been a very successful program. It's quite intensive, a lot of court appearances, and the incentive is that if they successfully complete it, their charges reduced or eliminated. But if they don't, the carrot and the stick approach, the stick is they go back to jail. Well, with no bail, if they want to drop out of the diversion program, they go back home. And so, unfortunately, one of our most successful programs is being undercut by the lack of any bail.
All right, if there's no more questions, we're going to wrap it up. But again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank the folks behind me for everything you do every day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, George.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
As always. Hey, Andy. How you doing?
Keep an eye on it.
Where are you from?
Lakewood Boston Police Department.
And you?
Westfield Police Department.
Jamestown Police.
This gentleman, where is he from?
Cuba Police Department.
Okay, and you are from?
Cuba Police Department.
You are from?
Rick Whitney, Allegheny County Sheriff.
You do a good without the tie, George. I'm here to back the blue, right?
Where are you from?
City of Dunkirk Police Department. Jason Schmidt, DA, here in Chautauqua County.
Okay, and you're from?
Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office.
Thank you.